Hi, I'm really excited to be having this conversation. This is going to be a phenomenal episode, and I just want to say congratulations, Beverly, on today's episode. You might not recognize me, but I am your guest host on today's episode of Stories by Career Sistas. My name is Ronke Lawal. I'm a PR and communications consultant, and I have the honor and privilege of speaking to the mind, the visionary behind Career Sistas. Not only has she built this community, but she obviously has this amazing podcast, which I'm hoping more and more of you are sharing and listening to. But she has written an amazing book. And today we're going to talk about her journey, her professional journey, her book, and why she decided to create the community, Career Sistas. So thank you, Beverly, for having me as your guest host today. I feel very honored.
Yeah.
Please tell us a little bit more about yourself and why you decided to create this community.
Yeah. So, I had a fairly typical corporate career. I started as an accountant in the British Virgin Islands. I enjoyed the business background, but I realized that being a traditional accountant wasn't the right path for me. That then led me to do an MBA. So I moved to the UK 20 years ago and then basically moved up in different big corporations, working in roles from management consultancy through to business performance and customer experience in my last role. So I did that for the day job and sort of, made that shift from accountant to wider business operational person and leader. But I think I found that the day job was one thing, but I was spending an increasing amount of my time and my passion around things involving women, women of color, people who are outside the system. So in my previous industry, I started a group for women of color in that industry. And I realized in those conversations with those women, we would have panels and events, people from different companies would come in, that regardless of company, regardless of industry even, the themes were the same. We were always talking about the same things, whether it was networking or the challenges of moving up and getting a promotion and all these things about navigating workspaces became something that I realized there was a lot more that we had in common, that there was value in bringing the strength of that community together. So that then led me on the path of not just doing it from an industry perspective, but ultimately going on to create Career Sistas in the hope of creating something that resonates across a wider spectrum of women from diverse backgrounds to sort of share those career highs and lows and create spaces where we can see role models and all that great stuff.
How exciting. And I think, so obviously the work that I do within PR and personal branding, visibility is really, really important. And encouraging particularly Black women and women of color to be visible in a world and a landscape that often tries to make them invisible can be really challenging. You talk about this in your book, which we'll get to, but I want you to highlight how you came out of yourself, how you came out of your shell to put yourself out there in the first place, particularly in the corporate space, because a lot of people would agree that it can be quite terrifying to be the only in the room.
Yeah.
And you are incredibly modest and humble in the way you deliver your story because you have had an incredible career. How have you managed to come out of your shell and carve this path for yourself authentically?
Well, I mean, it definitely didn't happen overnight.
Okay.
It definitely was something that I got better at with time, right? So I certainly didn't have, a sort of magic pill that enabled me to do this. And I wasn't a natural extrovert. I wasn't the person personality-wise that was putting myself out there. So certainly if I reflect back to who I was in my early 20s, I was not only introverted, I was incredibly shy. So I was the person who at university said nothing. I was the person who was completely quiet.
What?
I was always a doer.
Okay.
I always got things done. So I was the person who was happiest putting things together behind the scenes, making them happen, making sure things were excellent, things were done well. But it was much later that I became comfortable putting myself forward more. And that's been a journey. I think over time, as I took steps to put myself forward in little ways, and I achieved those successes in smaller settings, right? So maybe it's, whether, presenting something at an event or leading a meeting with senior leaders. And ultimately being in those spaces, realizing that I was just as competent, sometimes more competent than other people in the room. And over time, that gave me the confidence to say, you know what? I can see this needs doing. I'm often the one making it happen anyhow. I should go that next step further, putting myself out there to represent it, to be the face of it. So it very much has been this incremental journey.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And I think that's so powerful. One thing I don't want us to overlook is your identity, right? Your cultural heritage. Can you give us a little bit more context in terms of how your family and your culture gave you a foundation and led you to where you are now? Like, what happened? What were some of the, again, you touched on it in your book, but I really want us to talk about what were some of the key components to your, building your identity, your career, based on that cultural heritage and your family as well.
Yeah. Well, I think so much of us as individuals come back to our family and the community we grew up in, right? So if I start with family, I had a fairly traditional upbringing. My mother was a school teacher. My father was a Methodist minister in the context of the Caribbean. So, fairly conservative, religious environment. Both of them, though, I always saw them doing. I always saw, my mother was always starting women's groups and getting involved in the context of the church. My father was a classic introvert, but again, he didn't let that hold him back in his professional career as a minister and moving up into leadership roles, etc. So I saw that around me. And obviously, I had the broader context of growing up in the Caribbean, which I think to some extent was an advantage in that I had the opportunity early in life to see role models around me that were of diverse backgrounds. Now, not so many women, which is very much why I think some of my early passions have always been about women in leadership. A lot of traditional societies, are still very much run by men, even today, right? So even though I saw strong leadership in terms of people of color, politicians and everything around me, I saw less strength for women. And, that was always a motivating factor for me. Like, why is this the case, right? I look around the people around me in society and I can see that there are these incredibly capable women, not as many of them are achieving or moving forward in the same way. So that always kind of grounded me in terms of what my goals and ambitions were about, but still kind of based in that traditional supportive Caribbean background. And it's being from the British Virgin Islands. I think it's an interesting place in that it's geographically in the Caribbean. It's British by nationality. I had a British passport before I came to the UK, but it's geographically closer to the US. So the influences are all mixed. And then if I think of my identity in terms of ethnicity, so, my father is Black, obviously of African heritage, ethnicity. My mother is Indo-Caribbean, her family have been in the Caribbean for many generations. So they both identify more as Caribbean than anything else. But again, in a subtle way, I've got this blending in terms of identity that come back to the global majority, that come back to people of color, and this broader connection to the world, right? So in my DNA, I've got these connections to South Asia and to Africa, etc. Whereas I grew up in the Caribbean, I went to university in the US. I've been in the UK for the last 20 years, and I've been a citizen longer than that, right? So it's all these things, right, form a part of who you are. And you somehow aren't able to separate one from another after a while.
And when you as you're speaking, what I love about your story and the honesty with which you're sharing your story is that embracing of your identity, right? So I'm British Nigerian. I was born here. My parents came to the UK in the 80s and had me. I was raised here, and I still have a very close bond with what it means to be Nigerian, right? But I also have a very unique experience in the sense of, okay, so I was born in the East End of London, raised very Nigerian, specifically Yoruba, like the ethnic group, in Hackney, and in a country that I'm still minoritized. I'm a minority. It's a fact. It's a stating a fact. And having to understand, what it takes to survive and grow and thrive in this country. But then when you open up your worldview, like I did a year in the States, and I love to travel, and then you realize, okay, there's advantage to your cultural heritage and your background and your ethnicity, and you go into these spaces that you can. It carries weight and power to me and to you, and yet we still find ourselves in a position of disempowerment, or I should say, othering, or disenfranchisement. Like, I guess the point I'm trying to make, and the next question I want to ask you is, how frustrating must it be for you, or somebody of your experience and your caliber? I'm going to be quite honest and quite frank. You have so much to offer in terms of worldview, and then you go into certain corporate spaces, and then you're seeing the same types of people achieving great things on paper, but not welcoming new and dynamic voices.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel, and how do you overcome that from a professional perspective?
Yeah. I mean, that's the question of the hour, right? I mean, and the reality is that's true of our world, right? That's not representative of a particular organization or country, even, right? That is representative of the world. So you can spend a lot of time focusing on what you can't control, or you can put your effort in focusing on what you can control, what you can influence. And certainly for me, I think, yes, of course you have the moments when you are a little bit frustrated that, I don't know, person A got a promotion over you, or whatever the individual situation might be, right? That's human nature. You see that, it happens, you feel what you feel. But what really makes the impact is what you then do, right? And I think, yes, I allow myself the space to feel the frustration with whatever situations might be in front of us. And I think, there are lots of situations in the world today where we might be frustrated with who our leaders are, or who's, kind of making these decisions, etc. But a lot of those things aren't things we can do anything about, right? So if we come back to the place of empowerment, we've got to focus on what we can do, right? And I think, one of my things is that in a lot of the spaces of power, we are minorities. But collectively, we are the global majority, right? Whether, if you think about women, are obviously half the population. If you think about people from non-white backgrounds, again, they are the majority of the world. So ultimately, if we focus on how we support each other, uplift each other, and I've found, there is more that binds us, that separates us. There are more people who want to help than don't want to help, right? So yes, you can't change the world overnight, but you can lean into your communities. You can make sure that you do everything in your power to be in the spaces where you're valued, the places where you're uplifted. And you might not be able to make that happen overnight, right? You know, you might be in a job that you hate, working for leaders who don't value, you know, your input, and you may not be able to change that tomorrow. But in the medium term, most things are possible, right? So, you know, I've always been very focused around staying in situations where the positives significantly outweigh the negatives. So even if I can't achieve everything I want, I know that I'm growing, I'm learning, I'm advancing in some way, even if not always. But then ultimately being intentional about thinking, okay, is this situation giving me more? And choosing when it's right to move on or not.
Beverly. Your words and your mind, really, there's something really special about the way you share your experiences, right? And as I was reading your book, as I was reading Build Your Table, I felt like beyond having a mentor, you were a real guide. Like there was so much truth telling and so much guidance with it contained within the pages of this book that I just got really excited because you know there's a lot of business books and personal development books out there, and there's not enough content or books like this for Black women and women of color, right? In my perspective, I feel like there could absolutely be more. But as you've just shared, something struck me in terms of mental health and psychological safety, because you've said a lot here about remaining upbeat and you know, knowing when to remove yourself from situations that don't no longer serve you. But how do you maintain psychological safety, or at least find psychological safety in professional spaces? And I remember it as a segment in your book in which you talk about resilience. And I don't necessarily want to use the terminology strong. I don't want to use the word terminology strong woman or strong Black woman, because I think that is a label that is often placed upon us, that even with the greatest of intentions, it actually can make us feel the burden more. So it doesn't necessarily serve our mental health. But from your perspective, yeah, how do you find psychological safety? How do you stay positive even in spaces that actually don't want us to be safe? And yeah.
I think the key for me has always been to find the safe place. Right? So the safe place is not in front of your entire team. The safe place is not in front of your boss and your boss's boss, etc. The safe place is finding the 2, the 3, the 4 people who you truly trust. Hopefully you can find some of those in your professional environment. If you can't, it might be people in your personal life. It might be a blend of the two. But it's having those people so that when the chips are down, you can say the things, you can release the steam that you can't in another setting. And I think, you know, having a place where you feel safe that you can do that allows you to go back into the professional setting with renewed energy. And, you know, certainly for me, I've got a close network of inner circle of women, as I call it, both in my professional life and personal life. And undoubtedly, when things have been down, the voices there are the ones who remind you how great you are, remind you that this is them, not you. This is the situation, not you. This is the environment, not you, right? And for me, that's been a key, right? There have been moments where I've used executive coaches and others in terms of, okay, how do I elevate this? How do I deliver this? How do I tackle this problem, etc. And occasionally, that professional help is useful. But I think for me, 90% of it has been the women in my corner.
I love that. Especially in a world, and I'm sure you've heard this, sometimes the world kind of tries to tell us that women don't support each other, or women aren't supportive, It's very weird, but I kind of feel like that's part of the patriarchal propaganda, trying to kind of encourage us not to support each other or be in sisterhood with each other. And I guess that really leads me to the question, you said something that really spurred something in me. Can you be your full self at work?
Yes.
Okay.
But
really?
So I want to say yes to that, in that you shouldn't hide who you are. But that doesn't mean that you bring every thought in your mind to a professional environment, right? It's like, I don't know, if you go to dinner with your parents or your in-laws, or you go to church or religious service, you don't bring the party version of yourself to those environments, right? So that's kind of how I see it. It's not that you have to be a different person, but there is perhaps a lens that is more appropriate in some places rather than others, right? So if I am in front of executives, there's a side of me that you see, versus if I'm with my team, versus if I'm with clients. And that's not saying that that is not authentically me, but that is the version of me that's appropriate in those scenarios, which is not the same version of me that might go to Carnival.
Yeah, okay. Now I've got a vision of you at Carnival. Like, okay. That's awesome. Look, I'm going to be really honest with you right now. What I'm enjoying about not only this conversation, but just about you as a woman, as a person, is just how easy you are to connect with. Like, in terms of human connectivity and connection, you are just a phenomenal woman. And I'm saying this quite honestly, removing, trying to be unbiased, but there is no ego with you, it feels like. And it does. So, yeah, no, I'm going to let you, it doesn't feel like there's ego with you.
Well, thank you for the compliment. I don't know if there's no ego, right? Like, everybody has some ego,
yeah.
Right? But I think, I think there's something about getting to middle age, perhaps, right? Okay. And just perhaps being a little more willing to say it as it is, right? To just sort of be like, look, I've, gone along the paths, remained quiet at times, etc. And, I might as well be more open. I mean, one of my goals in writing the book and being open and sharing is that I want to be, for the people earlier in their career, one of the role models that I feel I didn't have, one of the people providing the insights that I didn't have, right? I read books by, let's say, famous people, business leaders, political leaders, etc., and there were good insights in those. But a lot of it wasn't directly relevant to me. Or I might get advice from senior leaders at work with the best of intentions, but their advice wasn't necessarily actionable for me or relatable for me, right? So for me, it's how can I share what I've learned along the way so that I can help others maybe figure out a few things faster than I did?
Oh, thank you. And look, this book is part memoir, part business book, professional book, personal development. it has a lot of what I really enjoyed was the tactical approaches, the strategies. You gave some ideas in terms of planning and ideation, and specific tips and advice and guidance, but also a bit of homework. Like, this is what you ought to do. Talk us through why this book is important, particularly in the age and the era that we're in now, this digital social media era, and an era when DEI, diversity and inclusion, is almost becoming a dirty term, which it shouldn't do, but the world is becoming very strange at the moment, Beverly. I don't know what your perspective is, but...
I agree 100%. And I think everything you've just outlined there in terms of the world we live in today is a lot of the motivation behind the book, right? I remember 5+ years ago when after George Floyd happened, and it felt like the world was at a true turning point and really invested in not just diversity, but inclusion. And I was really enthusiastic about that moment. I thought, wow, this is a moment I didn't expect to happen in my lifetime, when corporations and governments and senior leaders and stuff are truly listening. And I was very disappointed when in recent times all of that has reverted to a state where we're probably worse off than we were 5 years ago.
Disappointed, but were you surprised?
Not surprised, but I had been hopeful.
Right.
I had been maybe naively hopeful that better things were due to come. But that was not the case. So you've kind of got the DEI angle. And of course, you can't ignore the technology, the digital, the AI perspective, right? It's changing work. It's changing careers. It's changing the way we think about what our careers will look like. And I think for me, that became a huge reflection in that the workforce is changing. The type of work people are doing is changing, which therefore does two things. It creates change and uncertainty, but it also creates opportunity. And I think there is, for the people who are intentional about being early adopters, there are so many ways nowadays to create that side business, to create your own platform, to put your own story out there, to put your own voice out there. That I think in whatever way you feel capable to do it, whether it's through social media, through podcasts, through writing, through blogs, there's so much you can do to control the narrative for yourself, that you can do to influence your brand, that I think, you're missing an opportunity if you don't take the opportunities that technology and the digital age are providing and only allowing yourself to feel potentially the negative impacts of the change, right? It's like the change that affects the way we work, that's happening. Maybe it's happened, right? So that we can't do anything about.
Absolutely.
But what we can do something about is how can we make sure that we're utilizing what's now out there, what's now available, to accelerate, to put ourselves forward more so that we're more in control of our destiny.
That is so refreshing. I think particularly from within certain communities and demographics. So if I can speak for perhaps the Black British diasporan community, right? Particularly, you referenced the pandemic era, and there was a lot of distrust around technology and how information was shared around that time, and there was distrust, and then there was a rise in misinformation and disinformation at some point. I mean, it's still continuing, but at some point it just felt like, particularly around the pandemic and around that time, there was this kind of misunderstanding or just lack of understanding or lack of desire to understand and trust information. And yet, as you rightly said, we have, with the access now to technological advancement that will hopefully change the lives of many of us who are minoritized in this country. But I'm sure there's fear there, because historically, you know, Black women, women of color, and Black communities, diaspora communities, are always the first to be cut. We see that now with the whole DEI scenario. Who gets cut first from the team? How do you make sure that when you're building your table, you not only stay rooted in understanding of technology, but also you can stay rooted in an understanding of your self-worth and value as a professional in these spaces?
Yeah. I mean, there are a few things in there, right? So I think when you think staying rooted in yourself as you're sort of building, etc., for me, one of the key things is diversification, right? So in today's world, yes, there's still value for expertise, etc., but a lot of the expertise is getting superseded by the technology, right? So I think you've got to be broader than that. You've got to be able to navigate the systems, understand what's going on, and then think about where can you leverage your strength, your skills to show up in multiple places, right? So, for example, you know, the way I was brought up, you know, you kind of think you're going to have a career, you're going to work for a single employer, you know, maybe you'll move employers, but it's about that job, that career path, right? You know, you might have expected to be, whether it's an accountant or lawyer, whatever, right? Now, that's all well and good, but if you think about building your table and building, say, your reputation, okay, so what's your area of expertise? Does the world beyond your current employer know that? You know, if we look at your social media, if we look at the network you've built around you, does your network extend beyond your current department, beyond your current employer, right? So the more that you've diversified your community, your network, the platforms you're showing up in, etc., that means that if things happen that you can't control, if unexpected things happen, you don't just have one thing. Like a simple thing for me has been, even though I was predominantly a single career, you know, one employer person, I spent a lot of time volunteering, you know, being a charity trustee or mentors, etc. And it's been interesting that as I've entered into this current phase as an author, a podcaster, an entrepreneur, etc., a lot of the people from that other sort of professional life that came from the volunteering, etc., have now begun to play a bigger role in some of the things I'm doing now. So completely unexpected. I couldn't have predicted, you know, even a couple of years ago, such would have been the case. But it still comes to show that simply by my network being bigger than a single company or industry, it meant that as I was pivoting, I didn't just have one set of people who knew I was great, one set of people who believed in me, one set of place to find sponsors and others.
I love that. And I've got so many questions now I want to ask from that answer. So let me just stay focused. In the book, you talk about sponsorship. So that's a really good segue. You talk about sponsorship versus mentoring. You actually also have an episode on the podcast about sponsorship versus mentoring. I'd like you to give us just a little bit more insight, because I am so passionate about this. And I believe, and some people might disagree as they're listening and they're watching, that Black people, Black women, women of color, people of color, are over-mentored. I believe mentoring has become almost like an easy kind of tick box exercise. Oh, let's start a new mentoring program in our organization or in our industry. Oh, let's do that, without actually giving them the tools and just the opportunities to grow in a way that means, because they just want jobs and they want money and they want to accelerate through their careers. But mentoring at a point, as much as I love and I think mentoring is great, at a point I don't think we need any more mentoring. I think we need more sponsorship. So talk us through, from your experience, how sponsorship has helped you, how you've used sponsorship to help others.
Yeah. I mean, just to sort of pick up that point and maybe elaborate a little bit on the difference, right? It's like mentorship is valuable because, particularly when you're new in a company, in an industry, you're making a pivot and you need knowledge, insight, skills, mentorship is great. But mentorship doesn't come with any commitments. You've got no skin in the game around mentorship, right? You can have a successful mentorship program and, the KPI for that was simply that, we matched up 100 pairs, they met twice, tick box, we've had a mentorship program. Yeah. There's nothing in mentorship that necessarily focuses on what's the opportunity, what's the achievement, what's the progress that comes out of that. Whereas sponsorship is something completely different. Sponsorship is around, the people who put you forward, the people who advocate for you, the people who speak up and represent you when you're not in the room, right? So therefore, it's pretty hard to get. I think how I've developed sponsorship over the years, and it's not easy, I think there were times when I realized that I was in an environment where there wasn't anybody around who was interested and able to be my sponsor, right? So for example, working in a global company where most of my leadership team were based in the US, not seeing them much, so you're not getting the FaceTimes, you're not building the relationships, etc. with them. You're sort of having these limited exchanges in a very limited way, often on a call with many other people. And the people who were co-located with me, my role was minor to them as individuals. It might have been significant to, 100 people, but to any one person, it was insignificant. So therefore, getting the FaceTime with them, to sort of build and it just wasn't high on their agenda. They had other people in their teams more closely connected to their work that was more worth their time and effort. So I don't necessarily hold that against them, but that was me recognizing this is a situation where it's going to be pretty hard for me to progress because I'm not really able to kind of build that sponsorship, to build that support around me. Versus in situations where simply doing a good job and having the opportunity to be visible, right? Being visible with the people who matter, the people who make decisions, right? So sometimes it's as simple as having a leader who is confident in their own abilities, in their own strength, who's willing to say, hey, Beverly worked on this project and delivered it. You go present to the exec, right? So you sometimes need someone to open that door, but that person doing that then creates the potential where actually 10 more people in that exec room might be potential sponsors because they've had an opportunity to see me. They've had an opportunity to get to know my work and not just know the output of the work, but be able to question, have a discussion, understand the thought leadership and ideation behind it, right? So it's like one of the key things to building sponsorship is simply having the opportunities to work on things that are valuable, high profile, etc. And then having the visibility with the right people. And then ultimately, yes, you've got to be intentional about building those relationships, continuing the visibility, etc. But the hardest bit is that first door, right? And how do you get in that first door? Does somebody make an introduction? Do you have a direct line to them? There are multiple things that go on in different settings, but that first leap, being able to sort of create that situation, be in that situation where, you're visible, you're seen, you have the opportunities. From there, you can go many places.
So basically, you need to find someone with the key to open that door.
Yes. I mean, in smaller companies,
Yeah.
it might be easier, right?
Yeah.
Like, you might be working in a company with 50 people and you know the CEO. And in that scenario, maybe it is about you taking the initiative to have a conversation, etc. But certainly in bigger organizations, you typically may need somebody to open the door, give you a chance, put you forward for something, etc. Right? So sometimes you've got to take some side steps to get to the sponsor, right? Like you could see that the people who are the true decision makers might be 2-3 levels away from you. So you might need the levels in between to support and advocate for you in the way to becoming sponsors, right? Because you can only truly be a sponsor if you've got the power to make things happen, right? Like, your leader could be wonderful, but they may not be powerful enough to make things happen, right? So it's understanding the organizational dynamics and then thinking, are you in a place, can you influence, can you be seen? Are there people around that can help make that happen?
Oh, I love that. And it's so important. And you've used the word visibility in this conversation, but also in the book. And before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of what visibility looks like, I really enjoyed, there was an anecdote that you shared about a hiring exercise that you had to undertake. You were hiring with alongside another. It happened to be a white gentleman, and you both had the opportunity to have shortlists, right? And his shortlist looked very much like basically him in junior form. So he selected 10 names or 10 profiles, or CVs, of newly qualified professionals, but they basically all mirrored him. They reflected his lifestyle of, going to a certain kind of university, enjoying certain kinds of sports. And your shortlist was a lot more inclusive and diverse and based on not only their qualifications, but again, going back to that worldview and that, that diversity. When we talk about visibility, what happens when you think you've done everything right, got that CV, and then you're faced with a scenario just like that? And maybe the question I should ask is, as a leader, so I guess you are the you're a great example of someone doing it right. So how do we encourage more leaders to be more like you, where you're not just selecting people who look necessarily like you? You were, yes, you were more inclusive, but you were also, it was not just about necessarily selecting mini Beverlys. You were more open. How do we encourage that level of disruptive leadership?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And I think whoever has the answer to that, will be well on their way to making a huge impact in the world. I truly don't know if you can encourage it.
Okay.
I mean, it's like training for bias, etc. You can do it. People sit through it. They tick the box.
Yeah.
Nothing changes unless they want it. Right? So I think you can do all the right things, say all the right things, but I'm not typically willing to put in the effort of trying to convince people, because that is pretty hard to do.
Yes. Okay.
People who are open and want to be more intentionally open and want to be more proactive and think about the diversity and, more important, the inclusion within their teams, they will educate themselves. They will lean in. They will read books like this, talk to people like me and others, right? And they will lean in and figure out how to close the gaps for themselves. But I think if people aren't open enough to lean in, I'm not sure it's worth the time and effort, with all the things there are to do in the world, to try and convince them. I think, yes, let's tell the stories, make it visible, make it transparent, write it down and all of that. So it's there for those who want to digest it. But I think I prefer to focus my efforts on places where I think there is greater success. So I sort of come back to just like in the example of the sponsorship and so forth. It's like you can do all the right things, you can be in all the right places, but ultimately, you can't convince somebody who doesn't want to be convinced, right? You know, one of the red flags is if somebody tells you they don't seem color, run, because that means nothing, right? It's like, so it's if you're in a place, in a situation where you don't have leaders that are truly inclusive, get what you can from the situation, but don't expect the situation to change.
Yeah, wow. It almost feels like a mic drop moment. That almost feels like that was profound advice and important advice. And you had lots of similar advice within the book. Talking about visibility again, so I want us to go back to visibility. What are the key things that you want people to remember, particularly women of colour and black women, to remember when it comes to visibility? You identify a few things that they can do in the book, but remind us, talk us through why visibility is so important and what they can do, particularly, and I love your honesty, if they're introvert.
Yeah.
Not an extrovert.
Yeah. I think, you know, when you think about visibility, it's the bit that kind of brings it all together, right? Like, you know, you can get the education, you can get the experience, you can do all the right things. But if no one knows, it's meaningless, right? If the right people don't know, it's meaningless. So that's what visibility ultimately comes down to, right? Do the people who matter know what you're doing? Is the work seen? And I think a lot of the time, maybe particularly women, we sort of just think if we do good work, it'll magically speak for itself and everybody will know it. Yep. And I always remember a colleague years ago, and I remember just observing because we were peers doing very similar things for different the different groups, but we were so basically doing kind of the same job but for different groups. And he would go out and every little thing he did, he told 10, 20 people. Like everybody knew.
Okay.
And he basically seemed to have spent more of his time telling people about what he did than actually doing anything.
Yeah.
And by comparison, I remember thinking I had done 10 times as much, but I hadn't told 10% of the people he had told. And I remember our joint leader kind of said to me, a woman one day, you know what? You've done a lot this year. Don't do anything else. Save the rest of the things for next year. Spend your time talking to people.
Wow.
And, you know, the fact that she kind of blatantly said that was one of these moments for me when I realized that's exactly what he was doing. He might have done not even a quarter of what I had done, but he had spent all of his time making sure everybody knew. Because the reality was, when you think about what the senior leaders know and remember, they don't know the long list of things I've done. They probably don't care. But they remember that Tim, John, whoever talked about this to them.
Yeah.
Right? So what stands out? Is it the fact that somewhere at the back of their mind, they might know that Beverly did these long list of things? Maybe, if you're lucky, your immediate leader knows that, nobody else. But when you're talking about particularly organizations, big organizations, where many people weigh in, ultimately what matters, particularly if you are a person of color, etc., is you need the majority of people to think you're amazing. And the majority of people won't think you're amazing if only one or two people have visibility of your work. So you do have to be quite intentional and strategic around that balance of there's no point being head down, just doing more and more, but balancing that with taking the 10% of the time to make sure people know what you've done. They understand how you've done it. They know it's your idea. Because otherwise, when they only hear it from your boss or your boss's boss, it gets lost who did it, right? So you have to build that brand, that ownership, that credibility. People need to know the value you bring. And only through doing that do you kind of lay the foundation to move on to other things to build that reputation.
That's fantastic. And reputation is so important, particularly when it comes to personal branding and building a legacy for yourself within the career landscape, within your career journey and professional and corporate landscape. I think one of the things I really wanted us to talk about, though, in kind of looking at your journey and looking at the advice that you give within the book, is how do you do all of this without burning out?
You've got to be very strategic. So for me, I've always been an extremely structured, organized person, planner.
Absolutely, absolutely, I can tell.
So I think for me, it kind of comes into its own, right? In that I'm quite intentional in thinking through what's important, right? And, you know, as I said, along my career journey, I've learned some of these things. I've learned how important the one-to-ones are. I've learned how important the visibility is and the building the network is, etc. So when I think about my work day, my professional day, I'm not just thinking about the time to get the work done. All these other things are built into it. And it's equally important whether you're working for an employer versus if you're working for yourself, right? You know, as I've started on this journey as an entrepreneur and sort of putting out the podcast and the book and so forth, the same themes have been equally important, right? I could sit there, head down, you know, trying to get a podcast out, whatever it is. But the time I invest in networking, meeting people, the insight, the value you gain from that, right? Whether it's connections, somebody that can make an introduction, somebody that can help you get something done more efficiently. There's so much learning that comes from all these things that I think psychologically that we sometimes things are unimportant, that we sometimes think are, yeah, I'll get to that when I can. But actually, if you prioritize all those other things around it, the networking, the visibility, the letting people know what you're doing, you'll be surprised the impact it can have. Like a simple example is in the corporate setting, you know, by talking to other departments, by talking to other leaders around the things you're working on, you might learn about new tools. You might learn about another department who's doing something similar, and there's the opportunity to collaborate and make it better. And like there have been so many of those connections and amplifications that have happened in my career that have come through networking that ultimately make the work better and mean that you're working smarter than if you just sat head down by yourself. You know, that diversity of thoughts.
Again, like your mind and the wisdom that you continue to share is so important and so valuable. And I don't want to get you into trouble, but I do want to ask a question about what is the most radical piece of advice that you could share with not only, you know, new starts, new professionals, but also career changers and entrepreneurs, because you are on an entrepreneurship journey right now. What's the most radical shift, and what's the thing that you think needs to take place in this world of professionalism and world of work that can make the biggest difference? So,
I don't know if it's radical, but I think fundamentally put yourself first, right? Every organization is putting themselves first,
yes.
right? Particularly nowadays, right? Technology is changing the way people work, businesses work, things operate. Every business out there already doing it, will do it, is evaluating what staff do I need, what roles do I need filled, what new skills do I need, etc. So if organizations are selfish, right, around what they need in order to ensure their survival, right? Because, you know, If you continue working the same way 10 years into the future, the way that you worked 20 years ago, that business won't survive either. Right? So every organization has to be selfish to ensure their own survival, profitability, etc. Right? Therefore, you've got to be just as selfish, right? And you can't be afraid to walk away from a situation. You can't be afraid to put yourself out there. And I think it all comes back to that being intentional and being intentional about doing the things that are right for you, right? Which, if your employer is doing all the right things, those two things may very well align. And if they do, wonderful, right? But not to be loyal or not to be safe for the sake of being so, just not to upset the boat. Because should the dynamic change, they don't have any loyalty to you, right? Whoever you are, whatever level you are. So you've got to be just as selfish in thinking about your career. Now, that doesn't mean don't be fair to your employer. That doesn't mean if you're being paid for, a day's work, a month's work, that you don't do that. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying, as you think about your development, as you think about your network, as you think about your profile and your platforms, that you're doing that in the best interest of you, holistically, future you. Where do you want to be? Where do you want to go? And not just what your employer needs today, tomorrow.
Yeah. Oh, what I love about that, and it kind of it leans very much into the purpose of Build Your Table, right? What I love about that is, and I'm speaking as a Black woman, a Black British woman, I've been conditioned, and some of my peers have been conditioned to put other people first. And often our labor has been used to uplift organizations, other people, and we're expected to be behind the scenes. And then when we put ourselves forward, it becomes a bit of a problem. We're seen as a threat. There's a whole pets of threat phenomenon that it becomes quite, who do you think you are? And yet there is power to owning your own journey and putting yourself first. And when you stand intentionally in that truth, it is transformative. And so hearing somebody of your background and in your experience reiterate that and kind of, I'm not saying you're giving us permission, but you're encouraging us. And again, what I love about that is, and you've said this before about the books that you've read, right? But there's not enough books like this for us.
Yeah.
And again, anyone can read Build Your Table. For anybody who cares, right? But when I say for us, what I mean is there's some really pertinent and meaningful and relevant anecdotes that enable me to see myself here. Even if I don't work in a corporation, I can still see myself here. And so for that, I thank you. And I really appreciate what you have done by writing this book and the courage actually it's taken to share some of your stories, because you included some quite personal insights. And before we round up and close off this conversation, I wanted to know, why it was so important for you to tell stories that were quite sensitive. Why was that important?
I think I felt there was no way I could be authentic without telling the whole story, right? Meaning not just the highs, but also the lows, right? Because life is both highs and lows, right? And we often don't talk about the lows enough, but the lows, if we allow them to, can often become a bridge to something else. And I think for me, that's been very much a part of the journey in sort of taking control, right? Like, you know, that fundamental idea of like, you can't change what happens to you, but you can control how you react to it, right? And ultimately, that then determines the outcome. So it's this idea of, you know, stuff happens. You can't control what happens to you. Good things happen, great. Bad things happen. You've got to deal with them. You've got to grieve them. You've got to recover. But as it relates to career things, you know, how do you use those lessons? How do you use those learnings to make yourself stronger? To think, okay, what do I learn from that situation? Because ultimately, that's all life is, right? It's a journey, and you've got to keep moving forward.
I'm sorry to. You're going to think it sounds really strange, but you have come out of this corporate world. You've entered entrepreneurship, and you're not a shark. You're not a ruthless. Like I've met people who've. I'm not going to use the term. Well, I'll say almost sociopaths, like scary because of that ruthlessness. And even and this is again what I admire about you. We talk about being a bit more selfish and putting ourselves first. And there's a way of doing that without turning into a monster. How have you managed to do that, given everything you've been through?
I mean, maybe there's something about the household I grew up in where, you know, I had parents in a family that were very service oriented and feels like education and so forth. So maybe there is something starting there, right? In that there's always, even though I've had a sort of business career, there's always been an interest in people and helping and making a difference and all of that, right? But, you know, a lot of those stereotypical images of the way to do business, they work for some people, clearly, right? But I've always been passionate that there must be an intersection where business can happen, but you don't have to trample on people to make that work at the same time, right? Now, obviously, you need laws and structure in places that don't encourage people to abuse systems and everything. So you need a reasonable playing field for that assumption to be true. But I think, you know, we sometimes think of good in the context of the charity sector, etc. And obviously, the charity sector is incredibly important, the nonprofit sector is important, but that relies on donations and goodwill. So to me, it's always limited by, you know, the tide of the moment, what people are willing to support, etc. I think for something to be sustainable, it has to be built and grown and self-nurturing in its own right. It can't just rely on donations. So, you know, I'm definitely of the school of thought of surely we can make the world a better place. I mean, business is simply, you know, making things happen, providing goods and services that we all need in different aspects of our lives, right? And ultimately, as individuals, we make the choice as to what businesses we support. Are we going to support the businesses who are sharks and don't do things right and are aggressive and mistreat their people, etc.? Or are we going to support the business on our high street, the business that is run by women and people of color and reflect the world as we want it to be, right? So again, maybe I'm still a little bit too hopeful in humankind that I still think it's possible. And I still think, you know, we can make that world. And I guess I will always try to be part of that world rather than the world that's trying to crush others.
Yeah, and we need the dreamers. I'm not calling you a dreamer. It's good to be a dreamer. We need the dreamers, and we need people to be hopeful. We need people like you in the world, because without people like you, the world becomes almost a hopeless place. So we appreciate what you have created, what you continue to create. So you've got Career Sistas, which is a community. you've got Stories by Career Sistas, which is a podcast, and now you have your phenomenal book, Build Your Table. What do you want your legacy to be? Because you've already created these platforms and these resources. Some could argue that that's it, that's enough. Where do you see all of this going, and what do you want your legacy to be?
Yeah. So I've sort of said that holistically for Career Sisters, the mission is around empowering each other, right? So I feel like I'm starting things by telling my story, but I don't want it to be just about me. I want it to be a place where other stories are told. We're doing that to some extent on the podcast, but I want to do even more of that. I want to be able to sort of bring in more businesses, particularly businesses that are owned and run by women and women of color and Black women, and amplify each other, right? The traditional old boys network is very good at supporting each other. I want to play a small part in helping us do the same thing, amplify each other, support each other, buy from each other, uplift each other. So so that is what I hope the legacy is, that this is the start of the journey where we do more of that. And it doesn't become, I guess the end state is that it's not so unusual, right? And that it is just the way we operate, right? That we support each other. We have more businesses and others that are from diverse backgrounds representing our world, right? Like we're not going for world domination. We're not trying to have a disproportionate place in the world, but it's about that equity, that equality, that equal representation, so that it's not something special and that you're not reading the stats and it's like, the percentage of CEOs in the world that are women or that are women of color or that are Black women are this minute number compared to the rest of the world, or, in other spheres, leadership, etc. It's about getting to that place of equal representation.
And with your help, and with everything you've created, we'll get to that. We'll get there.
Well,
yeah?
hopefully we're a small step on that journey. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Beverly. It's been, again, I'm going to keep saying, a real honor and a privilege to speak to you. And thank you for allowing me to share this platform with you. And I want everybody to read this book, to subscribe to this podcast, and to join the community. Everyone. Well, specifically Black women and women of color, but also everybody. Thank you, Beverly.
No, thank you. It's been a great discussion, and I'm sure everyone will appreciate you leading this discussion on this episode of Stories by Career Sistas. So thank you.
Awesome, thank you.